this opportunity to discuss acquired brain injury. I've somewhat been listening to Fiona there, and I could echo many of the issues that she has raised, because the same would be happening for people with acquired brain injury on discharge without follow-up. I'm starting at the end, I think, in a way, because of the way things are evolving. I found a letter recently that I wrote many years ago about the lack of brain injury services, many years ago, and it's as relevant today as it was back then. Not a lot has changed, and this is very disappointing, as Ireland has ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But there has been no improvement in services to align with the various articles of the Convention. And these figures will include people with stroke, I believe, as well. There are some 800,000 people in Ireland with a neurodisability or condition. There are 120,000 people living with disability following an acquired brain injury. 19,000 people sustain a brain injury annually. That can range from mild brain injury through to very traumatic and serious brain injury. And additionally, there are 40,000 people with epilepsy, and many of these conditions can coexist. And so many people with acquired brain injury also have a dual diagnosis and need a number of different types of clinical and rehabilitation services. There's a lack of structure from acute hospital services through specialist rehabilitation, and no step-down facilities, community services or supports in place. The 2019, the National Strategy and Policy for Provision of Neuro-Rehabilitation Services in Ireland Implementation Framework 19 to 21 was published. 10 years on, from 2011, when this strategy was published, there's very little to show for it, and currently not the rollout of the community neuro-rehab services and teams as envisaged and as planned. There are a few pockets of services provided by ABI Ireland and Headway Ireland, but these are limited to a few geographical areas, and there's no implementation of the strategy as envisaged. It's fragmented and sparse. There's nothing resembling the National Clinical Programme for Neurology Model of Care published by the National Neurology Programme Working Group and the Clinical Advisory Group for the National Clinical Programme for Neurology. There are long waiting lists for neurological beds in Beaumont Hospital, and despite a complete rebuild of the National Rehabilitation Hospital, there was no net increase in capacity, particularly for people with brain injury. There's a long waiting list for rehabilitation, and many people with acquired brain injury do not get a bed at all, but are left at home for families to cope with, which Fiona has just outlined there, or cope with themselves depending on the circumstances as best they can. So we're back to a situation like we had in 1988, which I'll speak a bit to our personal experiences later. Additionally, the HSE National Clinical Programme for Epilepsy Model of Care document, which was launched in January 2017, nearly 5 years ago, has not been implemented, not even in part, and indeed the services for people with epilepsy have deteriorated. In fact, according to a report by the Neurological Alliance of Ireland in March 2021, there are 22,000 people on a waiting list to see a neurologist, an increase of 40% over the past 5 years. That is seriously under-resourced. Many people are actually becoming seriously disabled or dying as a result of this. And again, Fiona's touched on that. The recommended number of neurologists for epilepsy is 35. The actual number is 22. This is epilepsy alone. The waiting times have lengthened, especially over the past 2 years. There are no provisions for transport or community integration for people with acquired brain injury. There are three different types of transport schemes to help people with transport. But I understand at this time that all three have now been withdrawn with nothing to replace them. Many seriously disabled people are unable to access public transport, even if it was available. It can be an expensive trip to a Dublin hospital, especially now with the cost of fuel and parking and so on. There is no support or provision for any of this, and many people cannot get outside their homes unless they have a car and someone to drive them. I don't know if there was anyone watching the primetime programme the other night on, it was about wards of court, but there was quite a lot about disability and brain injury as well. They cannot afford to do these things on a disability or meagre allowance. A disability allowance does not equate with the cost of living. Everyone is aware that the cost of living with a disability is an added financial burden, as there are so many services and items that people must fund out of their own pocket. The cost of heating their homes has escalated to an extraordinary degree, and something will have to happen or people will end up sick in hospital or in nursing homes. Increases in funding for disability services are announced in the recent budgets and have been announced from time to time. That will take time to filter down, and we're still playing catch up with pre-2008 figures when the services fell through the floor. We know that in the public sector across the board, in hospitals and so on. So it affected disability services to an extraordinary degree, and I can give witness to that because I was there at the coalface at each and every time that all of these changes happened. We don't seem to see the budgetary increases filtering down to actual changes or improvements in services. Our eldest son was involved in a road traffic accident in 1988 where he suffered a catastrophic brain injury as a passenger in a car. He was on life support for many weeks in Beaumont Hospital, and later had rehabilitation in the National Rehabilitation Hospital after a lengthy wait and a stressful time trying to get a bed there. And it's the same now. This is very serious because this was 1988. It's the same now, and there's no follow-up to patients who are discharged, and families are left to cope, or individuals living on their own. It depends on their circumstances, and this is where the outcomes change, because some families have a lot of support, others don't, and it depends very much down to the families concerned. We spent hours travelling to hospitals, doctors, threats of discharges, and eventually there was discharge. And at that time, as it would be now, there's no follow-up, and there was no service at all. My son did well in the rehabilitation and offer at the time, but it was a specific brain injury rehabilitation, and he was allowed home eventually for weekends. He was prematurely discharged then, and there was no planning, no support, no services. He wasn't fit to be discharged and needed further rehabilitation, but that wasn't available. We were expected to care for our son in our own home without any help whatsoever. And the impact of all of this on the family was profound, because he had no insight into his difficulties having a brain injury. And when I tried to get help, I was told, I was working at the time, I was told it was my responsibility to stay at home and take care of him. We spent endless hours trying to find out more about brain injury and how we could help him. And back in 1988, this was difficult because we had no access to internet or information at the press of a button as we do now. Eventually, we found rehabilitation services in the UK, and our son got there after quite a long fight. In the meantime, the Office of Port of Court was involved, and I won't go into that here, but it is a limiting factor in terms of what a person with a disability can do. I go around it here a bit, I suppose, in that way. And we had to fight a battle with the services here to get a referral to the UK, and we had to fight a battle to get his own funding to take him to the UK, and there was absolutely no physical or financial help for us to do any of this. It was absolutely a terrible time. And then, when eventually he did benefit from the discharge, from the services in the UK, and the recommendation was after nearly 2.5 years that he would return to live semi-independently here with support for a trial period, with the view that that would continue. Of course, there was no more services here at that point than there had been earlier, so he still had no services, and we were here scrambling around for physiotherapy and support to help him. He was involved with a number of projects and had some support when he lived in Dublin, but it didn't work out very well because there was a lack of coherence, a lack of structure. It was just very ad hoc and falling apart because there was no one coordinating it all. He developed epilepsy, and at that point, with the acquired brain injury, this became a really, really difficult time. So it exacerbated the difficulties he was experiencing as a brain injured person. So over the years, when he returned back near our home to live semi-independently in his own home, we were trying to get services for him. And it was a constant battle over the 90s and noughties, and we still had to go back and forth to the UK many times for services. which we couldn't get here, or they were of such poor quality that we ended up going to the UK for them anyway. Because his father and myself in our 70s now have been providing support and care for all those years. And when we reached 70, we thought, something had to change. And we did have a lot of meetings and confrontations with the HSE. And I do say confrontations because meetings were contentious. They were saying, no, you can't have, and we were saying he needs. And it was a constant, this is what our son needs, and they're saying, but we're giving you. But I'm saying, I don't need anything, actually. My son has these needs, and this is the assessment, and this is what his needs are. And eventually we did get enough services to allow him to continue living in his own home, and that is working quite well for him and for us. And for that, and anyone who might hear this eventually, we are extremely grateful to those involved who managed to make that happen, despite all the odds being stacked against them. There is no comprehensive shared protocol involving all the different disciplines now involved. So that means gaps and confusion. So you've got physio or OT with the HSE, you've got an ABI service doing another bit, you've got another service provider doing home support, you've got the clinical end, you've got the GP. You see all the bits, all these moving parts, and you have no one person with all the information in any one place. So it really becomes extremely frustrating and difficult. And for us to step back from this and allow it to progress as it should do, it's impossible, because it keeps coming back to me, because it seems like I'm the reservoir of all information for everything and everybody. There's insufficient physiotherapy, occupational therapy, psychology services, and appropriate brain injury services are not available in every area. And even what is available is not often suitable to a person who is post-injury, maybe like our son, 30 years post-injury. It's very much geared to people who are newly injured. So it's a very different type of service needed there. And there's lack of recognition, or probably lack of service funding, I don't know, to separate out those services and provide different types of services for different categories of people with acquired brain injury. There's no day service, no centre to hold the service or hold it all together. Our son's life lacks meaning and purpose. It seems like all our work still wasn't enough to get our son and others like him the services that were recommended and needed. So there's no standalone specific brain injury service, despite all the reports and recommendations made and accepted. And they're included in the overall disability services. There are insufficient physiotherapists, occupational therapists, neuropsychologists, and other clinical staff. There's no one to replace them when they go on leave, which may be for an extended period. And the person is left high and dry without any service or a reduction in an already meagre service. At one stage, a whole year went by when our son didn't have any physiotherapy input, and that would have a hugely detrimental impact on him, and he would be regressing. So it's a constant battle to keep the services and to keep going. The situation since the advent of COVID has been very difficult, with a loss of services and face-to-face meetings with clinicians. Case reviews have been held via an online forum, and there are continuous gaps. And you have to look for everything, and protocols that were in place regarding spasticity, for example, appear to no longer apply. The rules change without explanation. And I'd like to raise an issue as an aside here, if I might. There's a big problem around online. Everybody is assuming now that everybody is online and can do Zoom meetings, or I don't know, whatever else. Yours is not Zoom, but you know what I'm saying, it's an online forum. Now, there are many, I can't state this strongly enough. I don't have that problem, thank goodness. But a lot of people my age and people with brain injury, they are not able to access this. They are not able to do this. And not alone that, but in a lot of areas, and we see it on the newspapers every day, there isn't broadband in every area of the country. And you need up-to-date equipment to be able to access this. You can't go into an old computer 10 years old, it probably won't do it. So it's not feasible for everybody to do this. And I'd just like to place that before the committee as an aside, but it is across the board, I think, very important for everybody. So that's my piece. I'd like to thank the committee, Chairman of the committee, for your attention to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary.